In late August of last year, hundreds of thousands of ethnic Rohingya Muslims fled Burma's western Rakhine state for Bangladesh as the Burmese security forces cracked down and committed unspeakable mass atrocities against its people. Satellite imagery shows that dozens of villages were torched, and testimonies of the refugees and survivors revealed systematic killings and massacres of entire communities and widespread rape of women and girls. Rape has been a prominent and devastating feature of the Burmese military's campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya, according to Human Rights Watch. Women were also forced to watch as their children, some only infants, were murdered before their eyes, some thrown into fires or stabbed to death, before they themselves were gang raped. The Rohingya are one of the largest stateless minorities in the world who have faced decades of discrimination under different Burmese governments. They are denied citizenship within Burma and denied basic human rights and health care, and have been subject to waves of violence in the past. The scale of how dire those conditions are difficult to overstate. They are the most persecuted minority in the world, according to the United Nations. When the waves of people began fleeing their villages last year, most fled into thick jungle, surviving for days on leaves until they could find a safe crossing into neighboring Bangladesh. Within a 4-month period, nearly 650,000 people, approximately half of the total Rohingya population of 1.3 million, trudged through mud and rice fields, crossed a river to Bangladesh on fishing boats, and then walked some more to refugee camps that were woefully unprepared for their arrival. They joined the other 200,000 Rohingya who had fled for Bangladesh years before during other bouts of violence. The conditions for the refugees became so dire, with so many new arrivals, that in late September, only a month after the latest crisis began, an emergency coordinator for Doctors Without Borders said, "The situation in the camps is so incredibly fragile, especially with regard to shelter, food and water, and sanitation, that one small event could lead to an outbreak that may be the tipping point between a crisis and a catastrophe." What does it mean to be a refugee? Your identity becomes stripped down. You are a number, dependent on everyone else around you. Today, there are more than 66 million refugees in the world. That is the highest number of people who have been forcibly displaced in decades, with war, persecution, and violence being the main root causes. When we look at why so many are forced from their homes, we start to see that everything is interconnected. In Iraq, for example, climate change and mismanagement drove poor farmers into the hands of ISIS, which exacerbated the ethnic and religious divides in the country. In turn, that fueled the conflict, which fueled the displacement of civilians. In Myanmar, state-sanctioned religious hatred against the Rohingya drove people from their humble homes. And amidst all this, the news cycle has been relentlessly replete with stories of suffering. But it has been difficult to shake away the lack of empathy in an increasingly polarized world. These images are from September, when displaced Rohingya women stood on the side of the road with their children, waiting in darkness for a food handout. Their husbands were nowhere to be seen, having been rounded up by the Burmese military and shot, or having been separated in the chaos of fleeing. What became immediately apparent was that there was so much room for the exploitation of these women and children at the mercy of human traffickers. Many have already been sold into sexual slavery. So, thank you for all coming out here. I wanted to start with a recent news story that I'm sure many of you have been hearing about, which is the Rohingya crisis happening in Bangladesh. And these pictures are actually from the start of my career, which I'm sure some people will have questions about. I started out in Libya in 2011. I was covering the revolution first in Egypt, and I went across to Libya without so much as an idea of what I was going to do. But I skipped across the border and started photographing what became a war against the government of Muammar Gaddafi, which had been in place for 40 years. And very quickly I learned that, covering conflict is definitely not something easy. I'm sorry, some of my notes are missing, so I'm just going to freestyle this. But I started photographing the rebels, who were mostly civilians in the beginning, and they picked up guns one day and became fighters the next. A lot of them had no idea what was going to happen, and I think that the conflict is often, the aftermath of the conflict is often a lot more messy than the actual war itself. All right, I just need to pause. Is there another way that I can read my notes from? Is there another computer that I can plug a USB into? No. All right. My apologies. This is going to be really, really freestyle. So, actually, I would really love if the audience could jump in with questions at any point, because it would also propel the conversation forward. So, I'm just going to talk a little bit about.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Could you expound more on what you just said about the aftermath of war is sometimes harder than the actual conflict?
Yeah. So, I think. One of the things that when you're photographing a conflict, there's a lot going on in general already. So there's people with guns, there's front lines, there's a lot of stuff happening that is very easily visually captured. But when it comes to the aftermath of war and people, when there's nothing, when it's a much quieter situation where people are trying to rebuild or get their lives back together, that is when they're much more aware of you as a photographer, being in their being in their faces with the camera, and I think that also the situation is a lot more difficult to explain in photographs to an audience. So that's what I meant by the aftermath, and also the aftermath is when people have to sort out how they're going to get along and eventually live together again.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What would you say to someone who's interested in a similar career path, or what advice would you give?
Can we hold that one until the end? Yeah, okay, great.
Sorry.
That's all right, no, it's great. Just because I want to focus on, anyway, we're gonna keep going. So when I went into Libya, I first went to Egypt and I was photographing the revolution there. I had no idea what I was doing, as I said. I went in without an assignment, but eventually I spent about 8 months in Libya photographing the conflict there. And I think when I look back at these photographs, I see a very general picture of the revolution and the war in general. But it was also, for me, an awakening because I realized that I had to focus on the stories that really mattered. And it wasn't about people on the front lines or guys with guns on the front lines. I had to focus on deeper stories that mattered and that could kind of be a bridge to an audience such as yourselves in a world much further away. After Libya, I started photographing a lot in Syria and Iraq. In 2012, I went into Syria illegally. I crossed over from Turkey and I ran across olive groves, through a fence, and through more olive groves, and then reached the Syrian side. At that time, it was also the beginning of a revolution against the government of Bashar al-Assad. The opposition had risen up and many were protesting in cities all across the country. What at first was a very idealistic revolution of demanding freedom and the downfall of the dictatorship soon very quickly became a crackdown and ultimately a war on mostly innocent civilians. And I think when we look back at the conflict on Syria right now, a lot of times we can only think of ISIS, we can only think of the Syrian government, but what was lost was really the people who were the most vulnerable in this situation, who were the civilians, who were often sidelined and not given the voice that they had to be amplified. I spent a lot of time also in Iraq covering the offensive for Mosul. And also looking at the aftermath, and I'll go back to that later, but the aftermath of the conflict against ISIS. But I want to go back to Syria, where this was probably the most difficult conflict that I've covered in the 3 countries that I've covered where there's been conflict in the Middle East. This was a situation where I spent a lot of time with civilians in their neighborhoods, and in these photographs specifically, I witnessed bombings and indiscriminate shelling of the government against civilians. So I would happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and be able to photograph people streaming out of the buildings when there was a bombardment going on. And a lot of the injured had to be taken to field hospitals or secret clinics because the government was targeting medical staff and hospitals as well. And eventually, I disseminated a lot of these pictures through international media, but I think that the results were so negligible that I started to see this futility of both covering this conflict and the situation in Syria itself. I spent a lot of time with the Free Syrian Army. These are fighters of the Free Syrian Army who, a lot of them were then absorbed into bigger groups and Islamist groups, and a lot of Islamist groups were then absorbed into ISIS. But in the beginning, this was really a people's uprising. And it was really difficult to make the larger audience or the public understand this because I think it was very easy to see only black and white, which was the Syrian government and ISIS. But I did, spend a lot of time with the civilians who underwent extreme trauma. And 7 years later, the conflict there is still going on. The most vulnerable are still targets day after day. And there is no resolution to the crisis there. It's only gotten more complicated as time goes on. I think seeing suffering of children, as we can probably all empathize with, is one of the most difficult things, where kids who had nothing to do with the conflict were just trying to go to school or go to the bread line and line up for their daily ration of bread. And so in the end, I think I had to leave because the situation in Syria just got so dangerous for journalists, foreign journalists especially, and also Syrian journalists and activists being kidnapped and executed.
It's just a dumb question. I've seen in a few of those pictures kids carrying white flags. Did the government forces actually recognize that?
Yes. The picture of kids carrying white flags were civilians coming out of Mosul at the time. And the Iraqi security forces had advised the civilians to carry white flags to identify themselves as non-combatants. So many of the civilians were actually carrying white flags when they came out. And also, what was very interesting was, under ISIS, women had to wear the full veil inside of Mosul, or ISIS-controlled territories. So when they came out, they would actually literally throw off the niqab, which was the face veil. And that was one of the signs that, they, for them, finally free. And watching men take the first drag of a cigarette, which was banned under ISIS, and feeling that sense of euphoria, again, was really, really, really amazing to see.
Can you speak more to the role of men and women during the conflict that you observed?
The role of men and women?
Mm-hmm.
Most of where I photograph are deeply patriarchal societies, where women tend to kind of have their place in the home and taking care of children, and the men are the ones who go out and work. And they're deeply conservative societies where sometimes navigating between the two as a woman especially is an advantage, actually. So, a lot of times I was able to sit with the men and kind of understand how they saw the conflict and how they saw the way out of this conflict. And then I was able to sit with women and see their views on the conflict but they had absolutely no power to enact that change unless there was some kind of civil society group that gave the women a platform to work from.
Can you be specific as to who was fighting whom? Was it, again, the Shias and the Sunnis?
So in Syria, which is extremely different from the situation in Iraq, Syria is, the government is actually controlled by an Alawite, which is like an offshoot of Shia Islam, and the majority of the country, though, is Sunni. So what was going on there was that the opposition was mostly made up of Sunnis, who also saw the kind of injustice of the Alawite government taking up the highest positions in government and also in the military, which had huge control, huge influence over Syria. In Iraq, it's the flip side, where in 2003, the US overthrew Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni ruling over a Shia majority country. And the situation in Mosul was very specific in that Mosul itself is actually a Sunni-dominated city, and they're surrounded primarily by, the majority of Shia in Iraq. So actually, a lot of the Sunnis in Mosul were blamed for welcoming ISIS in the beginning, and for siding with ISIS, which they did. Some people did, because there was a lot of injustice of the Shia government after the Iraq invasion against the Sunni majority in Mosul city itself. A lot of the Sunnis in Iraq feel like they're marginalized, and they feel like they don't have the same kind of opportunities that their Shia counterparts have. It's the same where they don't get higher positions in the military, and they're often sort of left out of big negotiations. That's changing a lot, but that's the situation generally in Syria and Iraq. This is actually one of my more quieter stories that is also about conflict, but a deeper story that I was talking about earlier, and looking at how conflict affects not only the people, but the landscape of a place. Also in 2012, I spent a lot of time in Aleppo at night photographing the landscape of the city, which before the start of the conflict in Syria, Aleppo was the largest city. It was about a population of 2 million people. It was industrially really important to the country. And after the start of the war, many or most people fled their homes. And this is what it looked like at night. After the start of the bombardments, in the opposition neighborhoods, the government had cut off water supplies, they'd cut off electricity, they'd cut off a lot of services in order to try to make people submit. So I spent a lot of time with my Syrian friends who took me around at night in opposition neighborhoods, photographing what it looks like, what a city looks like. A city of 2 million people. If you can imagine, New York City New York City is vastly bigger, but without all of its people, without electricity. After Hurricane Sandy, that's what it looked like. There was no electricity on the streets. And so when you look at it from this perspective, you can kind of think of how conflict not only changes the people in it, but also the cities and the livelihoods of those who inhabited it. So while we were driving around, I would actually just put up a tripod in the middle of the street and go on shutter speed and just wait for certain patterns of light to hit bridges or buildings. But it was incredibly, incredibly dark. And also at this time, it was the start of the rash of kidnappings of journalists in Aleppo. But I still felt like it was important to show this aspect of the conflict.
Was it the Alawites who were doing the kidnapping? And what percentage of the population are Alawites?
The population of Alawites in Syria, I can't off the top of my head remember.
Percentage.
But the Alawites, who are generally classed as people working for the government, either their paramilitary forces or the government. They were either, a lot of them were responsible for arresting opposition activists, and the thugs, who were called the Shabiha, were also responsible for kidnapping a lot of opposition activists, and not so much journalists. I mean, a few journalists ended up in the government's hands, but it was primarily, a lot of the times in conflict you'll find opportunists, people who feel like they can trade somebody for money. So there were a lot of rackets going on, but eventually it became mostly Islamist groups and ISIS who were kidnapping not even just foreign journalists, but primarily Syrian activists. This photograph in particular was a dead government soldier who had been killed and then discarded by the rebels on the side of the road. And there's somebody standing over him with a cell phone light trying to identify the body in this one neighborhood.
How did you stay safe?
How did I stay safe?
Yes.
That's a good question. I think it's very easy to come out of a conflict like this and feel very invincible because, you know, you survived it and your friends have survived it. But at that time, I didn't feel personally at risk as much as I felt my Syrian friends were at risk, because they were, if they had been caught with a foreign journalist and, you know, taking a foreign journalist around, they would have been executed by the government. For me, as an American passport holder, I probably you know, would be imprisoned. There are a few Americans in the government's hands still. But I probably wouldn't have had it as bad as the people who were taking me into these places. The risk that they were taking and literally risking their lives to show the world these images. I was only there to take photographs. Obviously, the story grew on me and the people grew on me. But it was never about me, it was about them.
So do you speak Arabic then? I mean, how many languages? How do you navigate language?
I speak basic Arabic, and but primarily when journalists work in countries where we don't speak the language, we work with people who we call fixers, but are actually local journalists sometimes, or local people who have a good deal of contacts with the people we want to meet with, and they obviously speak the local language and English so that they can help us translate. Basically, the fixer is the ultimate tool for journalists, or the key to how we do our work in such places, because we rely so much on them, and we put our safety and our lives in their hands.
And did you wear traditional dress?
In Syria, which is very conservative, I, especially in the Sunni areas, I didn't have to wear the full dress. I would cover my hair and wear a long shirt, and people were fine with that. But I think it's really essential when I go to places to respect the local customs and the local culture. And that is a way of gaining people's trust as well, when you show that you respect their customs and their codes. In this photograph, you can see on the horizon the government-controlled areas, which is fully lit. And then in the foreground is the opposition neighborhood, which has been completely cut off from electricity. And at this time, when I went up onto high buildings, my Syrian friends who were taking me, they were like, watch out, there are snipers. And even at night in darkness, you had to be extremely careful to not obviously be shot. A lot of the times the snipers would hide in the minarets of the mosques or in the highest buildings that they could find. So in the government areas, there were a lot of tall buildings that we would try to avoid. When I talk about the aftermath of war, and it being more difficult than photographing an actual war, I want to use Mosul as an example. So Mosul was liberated from ISIS in July of 2017 after a almost 7-month battle. in which many civilians were killed and also starved. The US had led the coalition bombardment against ISIS and destroyed a lot of the city. But this particular view was from the shrine of Prophet Jonah, which was sacred, who's sacred to all the three major religions in the region. But I wanted to show, and this project was done on the subject of peace and how people were able to attain peace in the aftermath of such a terrible conflict and terrible situation of living under ISIS. This picture wouldn't have been taken, first of all, at all, but the fact that people were out, coming back to Mosul after many people had fled was a remarkable feat. In this photograph, pretty much everything under ISIS would have been banned. You couldn't play games, you couldn't play dominoes, there was no joy allowed, there was no music allowed. You wouldn't be able to smoke cigarettes or the water pipe, which is very ubiquitous across the Middle East. Men wouldn't have had short beards because the religious police in Mosul, who enforced ISIS's brand of Islam, would force the men to grow long beards. They also wouldn't have been wearing Western clothing because, again, the religious police would have enforced a very strict code of dress for men and women to dress a certain way according to what they thought was appropriate. The owner of this cafe, interestingly, I talked to a lot of people who were trying to rebuild their lives, and his cafe remained open during ISIS's rule, which went from 2014 to the summer of 2017. And when I asked him, what was that situation like? How did you keep your cafe open? He said, well, I had to keep my cafe open because I had to earn a living somehow, but the religious police, called the Hizbah, would always come around and make sure, they would check my cafe to make sure there were no cigarette butts laying around, or that all the water pipes, if I had one water pipe laying around, they would either whip me, or I could be potentially sentenced or thrown into prison. And when ISIS actually came into the city, they collected all the water pipes and destroyed them collectively, along with books and everything else that they wanted to ban. This is in the old city of Mosul, and these are Iraqi federal police who are trying to maintain security there. All the civilians have fled, but you can see utter destruction all around. Now, the US was actually part of the coalition, as I said, who bombed a lot of the old city and destroyed a hugely rich cultural heritage that existed before. And I found what was really frustrating was that the US is now refusing to fund rebuilding projects in Mosul. And what this is going to have the effect of is radicalizing another generation who don't have opportunities for jobs. And I think that this picture just kind of says a lot about the potential of the future if we don't sort of speak up, or if the US government refuses to help and mitigate some of the costs of rebuilding. Also, what I found was really important in rebuilding was talking to Sunni tribal leaders who are imperative to the future of Mosul because, again, it's a Sunni majority city. The sheikh on the left-hand side, when I asked him, what does peace mean to you? He said, we are no longer a part of that word anymore. The Sunnis of Iraq are no longer a part of that word anymore. We don't feel like we're a part of Iraq anymore because we've been so marginalized by the Shia-dominated government. These are members of the Mosul Civil Defense who were still recovering bodies of civilians from underneath the rubble, even months after the campaign against ISIS had finished. A lot of civilians remained trapped under the rubble. So as I walked through the old city, I would see bodies, corpses that were rotting, that were bodies of ISIS. They would not touch those. They would leave those, and because they didn't want to give them the respect of a burial. But they would go and find the civilians and try to give them back to the families for a proper burial. And one of the huge risks of working in Mosul was that there's a lot of unexploded ordnance left over from the war. And this is one of the reasons why it needs a lot of help to rebuild because the civilians need to return, but they have to do so under safe conditions. I also wanted to show a different aspect, people coming back, rebuilding their lives, and also providing some kind of hope within their communities. I stumbled upon a wedding. It was quite amusing, actually, because they just happened upon this wedding where this woman was beautifully dressed, and the groom was taking her from her home, and they were going to be married. And this is all just, a few months after the end of the conflict. And you can't really imagine that there's color or, some kind of happiness that comes back, but in fact there is. What was really deeply humbling was to go to this amusement park, which was actually operating under ISIS for the families of ISIS. But under ISIS, a lot of, you couldn't show faces, any likeness of faces or animals couldn't be shown, so they would be blacked out with spray paint, or they would, have their heads cut off. But the director of this theme park came back to Mosul and was determined to rebuild and, as he said, bring joy back to the people. So when I came here on this certain day, it was really remarkable to see kids and everybody eating popcorn and going on the theme rides. And in the background is a pile of trash burning. But that is sort of also one of the dynamics of what Iraq is going through, where there's still a lot of basic services that are lacking in the city, but life is still trying to resist and come back. This is one of the last stories I'm going to show. This photo essay in particular is a very difficult one because visually it was not compelling, but I wanted to photograph how the situation in Turkey, where I'm based, is affecting women in society, and how the government is perpetrating a message that is very misogynistic and is affecting women.
Where are you based in Turkey?
In Istanbul. So since 2011, there's been about a 270% increase in the in murders of women. And a lot of this is it's separate from honor killings, which is something that has always existed in Turkey, and so is domestic violence. But this is also a story that speaks to a trend that is going on worldwide. And this isn't just in Turkey or in places that we don't often see or visit. This is also happening in the United States, where at least in Turkey, one woman per day is murdered because her ex-husband or boyfriend is jealous, thinking that she's been cheating on him or not, or that she hadn't cooked his favorite meal. But the reason why I followed this story was because of the political changes in Turkey, which the conservative government has become a lot more, strong in its message of saying that women have to have their place, and if you are a woman and if you don't have 3 children, you're insufficient. And this has filtered down into society where men feel empowered, also with light prison sentences. So you can literally get away with murder in Turkey, where the last family I interviewed, the daughter was 20 years old, and her name was Yağmur, which means rain. Her mother recounted the story of how she was killed. She was killed by her boyfriend. She was a month away from graduating from university when she was shot by her boyfriend, and he used a rifle and shot her at very close range. And it was an argument over something very silly. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but got off after 10 months because he was on good behavior. He prayed often. And his family was also a very close ally of the ruling party in Turkey. So I felt like these women needed their stories to be told, even though they weren't there anymore. And this is one of the things about photojournalism, which I think is so important, because in a world right now where we're flooded with images, I think something like 3 billion pictures are uploaded onto social media websites, through internet chat groups every single day. How do we try and filter the noise from what really matters. And I think that that's why it's so essential still to have accuracy and truth, and for people to remind us in these photographs especially of our collective humanity, and to give them back their dignity, and to remind us that we have to remember to be compassionate. So thank you.